Welcome to Creating a Family. Talk about infertility and adoption. Today we're going to be talking about what the latest research is showing us about how to increase pregnancy rates and live birth rates when going through IVF. This is a topic, as you would imagine, of great importance to our audience since most of them are trying to get pregnant, and many of them through IVF. Here's a sample of what you're going to hear.
There is very good data to show that transferring embryos in a frozen cycle might be even a higher success rate than in a fresh IVF cycle. And the rationale behind it is a number of things. Number one, when you go through IVF, as women know, they are tremendously pumped up from all these hormones. You're stimulated. A lot of women have hyperstimulation where their ovaries are really swollen and distended. You don't feel good at the end of a retrieval. That's great to get eggs out, but that's not probably the best milieu or environment on the uterus, on the target organ for implantation. So if you could freeze the embryo and bring that patient back in a month later, prepare the uterus more physiologically, more naturally, that's a better environment for implantation. And there's some very good papers that have been published showing, comparing fresh versus frozen, that frozen cycles might even be higher because of that. There's also a Japanese study which says the babies from frozen cycles, because the uterus is not wired and hyperstimulated, the babies might be healthier.
I'm Dawn Davenport. I am the Director of Creating a Family, the National Infertility and Adoption Education and Support nonprofit. You can find us online at creatingafamily.org. One of the things we do, in addition to this show and blogging and a huge presence on the social media, is we add content. We create content. And some of the content that we've created that I think you will enjoy is a multimedia guide on how to choose an infertility clinic. It is over 50 pages full of information written for the consumer, for the patient, on how to do this how to take this very important next step in treating your infertility. I think you will really enjoy it. You can get to it by going to our website, creatingafamily.org, hovering over the word resources, and click on eGuides, and it will take you right there. We are a weekly radio show, and we use the podcast model. That way you can listen whenever and wherever you want. You can also subscribe to this podcast on whatever device it is you are listening to it. Or you can go to our website, the radio show page, and subscribe there as well. The Creating a Family radio show is underwritten by our corporate sponsor, Ferring Pharmaceutical, for women who have been undergoing fertility treatment and are still struggling to conceive. Daily scenarios and interactions can take a toll on their emotional health. Ferticom is a newly released app for Apple and Android phones developed by reproductive psychologist Dr. Ali Domar and Dr. Elizabeth Grill. Ali has been on the show, or Dr. Domar, I should say, has been on the show a number of times, quite a few times. And she has been a great friend of the show, and we are a huge supporter of hers, and we're thrilled to hear about this new app. It is designed specifically to help women address the many challenges, emotional life situations that arise when struggling to conceive. You can get more information on it at their website, ferticomapp.com. That is F-E-R-T-I, Ferticom, C-A-L-M, app, A-P-P.com. This show, as well as all the resources provided by Creating a Family, could not happen without the generous support from our gold sponsors who believe in our mission of providing unbiased education and support to those struggling to create a family. Some of our wonderful gold sponsors include Shady Grove Fertility. They have over 25 years of experience and 40,000 babies born. Shady Grove Fertility uses proven medicine to achieve these results and specializes in providing patient support throughout the process. We also have IntegraMed Fertility. They are the largest network of fertility practices in the country. By combining the latest innovations in the reproductive sciences with compassionate and customized treatment plans, IntegraMed practices are able to provide the very best possible care. And Reproductive Medicine Associates of New Jersey. They are a recognized scientific and patient care leader in the field of infertility. With 10 offices and 21 physicians throughout New Jersey, they maintain an IVF delivery rate well above the national average. You can get more information on how to reach these sponsors by going to our website, creatingafamily.org, and looking under infertility or infertility at the top menu, and click on Find a Professional, and it will take you to our directory. Today, we're going to be talking about increasing pregnancy and live birth rates when going through IVF. We're going to be talking with a leading reproductive endocrinologist and researcher on this topic, Dr. Brian Kaplan. He is a board-certified reproductive endocrinologist at Fertility Centers of Illinois. Welcome, Dr. Kaplan, to Creating a Family.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Well, this show has developed in a way a little different from the usual. What caught my eye is I saw a presentation that you had done with some others this past fall, and you were talking about research you had done on over 65,000 IVF transfers, and I think it was over 6 years. Anytime, one of the things that Creating a Family does is we are the bridge between the research community and the patient community. And anytime I see research that has a large sample size and is over a long period of time, my ears and eyes perk up. I become interested. So I read that research, was fascinated by it, and contacted you about being on the show to talk about it. Since then, however, I have been Googling, and you have done a lot of fascinating research, much of it published within the last 2 years. So we expanded the topic. We're going to start with the research that first caught my eye. But we're going to expand and talk about a lot of the things that you and others are discovering about how we can increase pregnancy and live birth rates with IVF. I am really looking forward to this. So let's talk about the first research. It was done 65. The in size was large, over 65,000 IVF transfers. So one of the first things we're going to talk about is whether it's best to transfer a single embryo or two or more embryos, if your aim is to have the very best chance possible of a pregnancy with that in that cycle. We got a question from one of our audience, Renee. She said, I have two highest grade embryos that are day 5. We did not get pregnant on transferring one fresh from this cycle. I don't mind twins. For my frozen embryo transfer, why wouldn't I transfer both? So, Dr. Kaplan, let's talk about using Renee's question as a jumping off place. Let's talk about what you found in the research that you were a part of when I think it was over 15 centers, and you looked at over all the IVF transfers over a long period of time. And one of the things you looked at was single embryo transfer or double or more embryo transfers. So which one gives us our highest chance of getting pregnant?
So let me, if you wouldn't mind, I'm just going to take it back a step to explain the rationale behind it. And it's really a really good question that I face daily from this patient, and so I appreciate it. It's really a good question. The way IVF has evolved is that in the early part of this technology, the whole objective was to get our patients pregnant. And that was the demand by the consumer, that they wanted to get pregnant. They were struggling with infertility. The technology was time-consuming, expensive, intensity was enormous, and so that was our major goal. And in the beginning, when we were faced with this, in order to achieve pregnancies that were acceptable to the patients, we had to transfer multiple embryos, because the more embryos you transfer, the higher the probability of getting pregnant. So that was our objective. Our end goal was pregnancy. And because the technology was early and the success rates were not as good, in order to get pregnancy rates in the 20-25% range, we had to transfer 2, 3, 4 embryos sometimes. But what we found is as the technology improved, and we'll come back to that, what was happening is we're getting better pregnancy rates, but with that came the toll of multiple pregnancies. And we couldn't forecast which of those patients where we put in 3 or 4 embryos would land up with a triplet and even a quadruplet pregnancy. So the dilemma was, how do we balance the success rate of having our patients take home a baby, a healthy baby, and at the same time limit the multiple pregnancy rates? And that point is very important, and it's part of that question because, yes, twins sounds appealing. You have your 2 babies, you're done, you can move on, you're achieving both those pregnancies all at the same time.
2 babies for the price of 1, we hear people say.
2 babies for the price of 1, correct. The downside to that is with twin pregnancies, there is a much higher risk to both the baby and the mother. So when a woman carries a twin gestation, she is at higher risk for high blood pressure in pregnancy, diabetes in pregnancy, bleeding in pregnancy, cesarean section rates. Everything goes up with twins. And the most important factor is that there's a higher tendency to premature labor. So a woman goes into labor in a simple form when the belly's full, and your belly gets fuller when you have twins at a quicker rate. So you go into premature labor, and premature labor is a major concern for all obstetricians because when babies deliver early, they often haven't developed properly. Now, if you deliver 3 or 4 weeks early, that is okay today. But if you deliver 4 months early, the brain systems haven't developed, the organs haven't developed properly. So to the risk to the babies of cerebral palsy, of all the complications we fear in pregnancy goes up with a twin gestation. With a triplet gestation, it goes up even greater. It goes up exponentially. So the goal today, we've evolved from just trying to get pregnant to the end goal now being how do we maximize the chances of taking a healthy baby. And there's a big difference between those two things. So that's the dilemma of how many embryos do we put in to maximize the chance of getting pregnant, but at the same time reduce the risk to the mother and the baby. And so ideally, it would be healthier, and the babies are healthier if women have 1 baby at a time. Now, you might be lucky with 2 and land up with twins, and you might have a very healthy pregnancy, but the risk go up 3 to 4 times. And so that's a major concern for us.
And, there was some research that was published within the last 2 years talking about the risks associated with even a baby being born 2-3 weeks premature. The cost, the hospitalization cost is higher. People tend to downplay that because insurance is covering it. But they followed these children into school age, and they were finding that children born not even significantly premature, but children born within 1 month of their due date were having significant learning. There was a difference between the learning capabilities and learning disabilities and things like that. So we just, as a society, downplay the risks of twins, and we seem to almost fetishize it, that it's the preferred. So I'm very glad to hear you say that, in fact, the preferred outcome of IVF is 1 healthy baby and 1 healthy mom.
So your point is very well taken. And in fact, if you look at many countries, not that we have to replicate that, but many countries in the world today stipulate by law that you can't transfer more than a single embryo. So in Scandinavia, in the UK, where they look at society as a whole and the countries paying for the cost, just like you mentioned, it is even there's even regulation with that. In the U.S., we don't have laws; they're guidelines, but that's the premise. And so the question for us is, and that's where a lot of the research, clinical research, comes into play, is how do we do both? How do we maximize that chance, sustain that pregnancy rate at a very high level, but at the same time only transfer a single embryo? So how do we achieve both of those things without compromising one over the other? And that's where a lot of what you and I are going to talk about comes into play, because that's the objective today. So I can sit with a patient opposite her and say, yes, we'll only put in 1 embryo, but even though we're only putting in 1, we're still sustaining that pregnancy rate of putting in 2 in the past by selecting the best embryo that has the best probability of implanting.
Are single embryo transfers, single embryo transfers are increasing. And is this because of the push we've had in the field for the last 5 to 10 years? Or are there other reasons that are affecting why? And how significant has the increase been, let's say, in the last 5 years? And I think your study was from 2009, so that would be more like, 8 years. So how significant is the increase, or 9 years, I guess?
So it is significant, but the progress is slow. But if you look at our field, and the American Fertility Society, which comes out with with recommendations, has just come out with a new recommendation that's now considered standard of care. And more the standard of care, especially in younger patients or patients below 35 years old, is to transfer a single embryo. So if you look at the progression, if you look at the graphs of the number of patients undergoing single embryo transfer, it is continually increasing. But I think it's important for the consumer to realize that they need to be in a center who are very comfortable putting in single embryos based on their underlying technology. So you have to have the capability to have good success rates by putting in single embryos. So if you have suboptimal technology, then in that specific center, you might have to put in two to compensate for the technology that's there. But in the best centers in the United States, single embryo transfer is increasingly becoming standard of care, particularly for patients 35 and under. But
and
I think
people can tell when they're analyzing. They're on the Society of Reproductive Technology (SART). On their website, there are IVF success stats given for clinics. What specific stat would they look at to see what the percentage, because one of the ways to choose a clinic is to see which ones, how do you know if a clinic has the technology, good enough technology in order to be able to transfer the majority of theirs as single embryos rather than two. So what stat would they look at on the SART site in order to tell if they have that capability?
You know, the SART data is like all statistics, and I think it's relatively crude. You get a good idea, but it doesn't really tell you specifics, because centers have different populations, different patients have done multiple cycles previously. We all deal with a different population group.
Absolutely.
So
some centers refuse to take care of certain patients. Women, exactly, who they do not think will have a high success rate. And other centers are known for the ones, the infertility centers, are known for a place to go if you have failed other places. So that's a very good point, and your stats would look different between those.
Would look different. So I think when you look for a center, you look at the SART data as just one component of selecting that center. It tells you the volume, the experience they have. So they're doing a lot of cases. If they're doing thousands of IVF cycles, that gives their statistics more meaning. But I think you should just look at that SART data as one component. You want to go find out from your friends, their reputation in general in the community. Are they thought leaders in the field? So to me, SART is just, I would be wary of just using SART data as the only mechanism of selecting a center. And when you go to that center, the questions you should ask as a consumer should be, when you sit with that physician, you know, how many single embryo transfers do you do? What are your success rates with single embryo transfer? I mean, it needs to be asked at that meeting. And I think what's important also, and we forget in medicine, is we all work with numbers. We all work with algorithms. But at the end of the day, you're dealing with people. And we're all different. And we all have our own agendas. And we all have our own comfort levels. And so, patients have been through multiple cycles previously. So you have to try and individualize. And we use that word very cavalierly. But you really got to individualize on that specific patient. And I think that is very important, not just to look at that patient as a number. As a 38-year-old with X number of embryos, you have to talk to that patient so you know where she's coming from, her understanding of everything, her affordability, her tolerance emotionally, and that decision should be made together with the physician, with the patient, because in certain situations, putting in 2 embryos might be correct for that patient. So that patient's done 4 or 5 in vitros previously unsuccessfully, and if she's 40 years old, that might be an indication where 2 is appropriate. So it has to be very much individualized on that case.
Yeah, and I was glad you pointed out that economics do play a role as well as age and prior failures. All of those factor in to the decision. Yes. All right. One of the things that Renee had asked about was she's getting ready to do a frozen embryo transfer. Now, we're going to talk later in the show about the differences between and success rate differences between frozen and fresh embryo transfers. But just from the standpoint of her question about whether or not to transfer one or two, does the fact that the embryos are frozen in any way change the calculus of whether or not to go to transferring one or two?
So it's an excellent question once again. So let me, for a minute, I think it's important, number one, that the embryo has grown to the blastocyst stage. So it's grown to the day 5 or day 6 stage of development. That is very important because it's very different to an embryo that is put back into a patient on day 3. So the evolution of blastocyst development was a critical part of this paradigm of being able to reduce the number of embryos we transfer. So when we're talking about lowering number of embryos, I'm specifically talking about blastocysts. So you can't compare transferring a single day 5 or blastocyst embryo versus a day 3 embryo. A day 3 embryo does not have the same probability of implanting, and so if you're doing a day 3, then putting in 2 embryos is not unusual at all. We in our center and many of the larger centers believe very strongly that with the culture media and the technology available today, that day 5 embryos is the way to go, whether it's a fresh or a frozen cycle. That if the embryo doesn't make it to the day 5 stage in your culture environment, it is highly unlikely it would have done so in your uterus. There are exceptions to that. So if a patient is in her 40s, only has 1 embryo on day 3, you might consider just putting that embryo on day 3. But in general, day 5 development we think should be offered and done almost in everybody. Excuse me, so
okay.
That's a very important point. The second point is that embryos freeze better on day 5. Their survival is better. They implant at a higher rate. So all of this is based on the ability of that lab, which most of the good centers today in the United States have, of growing embryos out to the blastocyst stage. That's a very important point. The second important point is the ability of that lab, which most do today in the U.S., to freeze embryos efficiently at the blastocyst stage. So you have to have good freezing technology, which is done today, because you don't want to lose an embryo because of your technology in thawing the embryo out. If the embryo doesn't survive because it's not a good embryo, that's a different story, then you're just finding out sooner. But you want to have good freezing technology, and the freezing technology has really improved and got to a point where we don't believe there is a difference in that specific embryo, whether it's frozen or it's fresh. So I would, as a patient, I would err on the side that it's important that there's good freezing technology in that lab. That's number 2. Number 3, there is very good data to show that transferring embryos in a frozen cycle might be even a higher success rate than in a fresh IVF cycle. And the rationale behind it is a number of things. Number 1, when you go through IVF, as women know, they are tremendously pumped up from all these hormones. You're stimulated. A lot of women have hyperstimulation, where their ovaries are really swollen and distended. You don't feel good at the end of a retrieval. That's great to get eggs out, but that's not probably the best milieu or environment on the uterus, on the target organ for implantation. So if you could freeze the embryo and bring that patient back in a month later, prepare the uterus more physiologically, more naturally, that's a better environment for implantation. And there's some very good papers that have been published showing, comparing fresh versus frozen, that frozen cycles might even be higher because of that. There's also a Japanese study which says the babies from frozen cycles, because the uterus is not wired and hyperstimulated, the babies might be healthier. So there's even data downstream with the health of the babies. And thirdly, our biggest fear in the patient is hyperstimulation, where women feel very terrible after retrieval, their ovaries are stimulated, they can get sick. If you don't put an embryo into her that cycle, you let the hormones come down, she will feel better a lot quicker. Hyperstimulation incidence is far less, she'll recover much quicker, and so you reduce the incidence of hyperstimulation dramatically when you don't transfer embryos, because pregnancy sustains hyperstimulation for longer and increases the intensity of it. So if you can lower the chance of hyperstimulation, so healthier for the patient, sustain the same pregnancy rate, if not higher, and possibly have healthier babies, that's the rationale why we think freezing embryos is a very good idea in a large percentage of our patients.
We got a question on this. I think you've answered it. I'll go ahead and read it just so that Dana can hear that I've read the question, and I'll give you a chance to see if there's anything that you would add specifically to her question. And let me just mention that, of course, Dr. Kaplan could not be giving specific medical advice. He's going to be talking generally. This is from Dana. She said, I have a cycle coming up this summer, and by that she means IVF. I have to decide whether to do the egg retrieval in July, then wait a month and transfer the embryos in a frozen cycle, or to do a fresh transfer in July after the embryos grow for 5 days. My doctor is cool with either one. I've listened to this show for a year now, and I've heard your guests talk about the advantages of waiting and going with the frozen, but I can't get over the feeling like it would be best to do it with a fresh embryo so that it wouldn't have to be frozen. I'd love to hear your guests' thoughts on this. So any thoughts that you haven't said to Dana?
Yes. So Dana, you know what? You remind me of myself. I don't have patients as well. And so I can relate to that. And I know many of our patients have been through this for years. So that extra month becomes a big deal. And it's the waiting that drives all our patients, makes them very frustrated, and it adds cost. So that point of view is very understandable. And there is very good data, for example, out of Cornell, where they looked at their frozen versus their fresh cycles, and that's a very good center, and showed no difference between the two. So the difference that's why you're getting a mixed view, because the difference is probably not a huge difference between fresh and frozen. But what the important factor is that it's not lower with frozen, because you always think just logically anything that's frozen can't be as good as fresh. That's the logic.
Yes, that's
but
exactly
it
right.
is. That's what we think, but there is no difference. So I would look at your cycle specifically. During your fresh cycle, if you get a lot of eggs, if you get 20 eggs, and you're at risk for hyperstimulation, that's an indication to freeze. Number two, they will monitor your hormonal profile. And if your progesterone level towards the end of your cycle starts to climb, it's been shown that higher progesterone level creates not a good environment for a fresh cycle. So they're going to look at that progesterone level. If that level is elevated, you should freeze your embryos. You should base it on how many embryos you get on day 5. So you could say, well, I want the option. I'm going to see what happens, see what I feel on day 5. How do I feel symptomatically? What do my embryos look? You can make that decision on the 5th day. You don't have to make the decision up front. So once again, your physician should individualize. If the patient's very anxious, wants to do a fresh cycle, that would be fine. So there's not don't feel pressurized. It's not a dramatic difference, but we like that control of coming in a subsequent cycle and doing a frozen cycle. So I always tell patients when they come for a second opinion, you want to go with what that center is good at, what they feel comfortable at. You don't want to mix and match. You don't want to tell a center that feels very good with fresh cycles, well, the center up the road does frozen. I want to do your center, but a frozen cycle. Go with what their comfort level is, their data, and that's important to stick with their own philosophy in that center. So
I'm interested
wait
in
and see how you feel.
Oh, okay, good point. I'm interested in the research out of Japan that you mentioned. I have not read that research on the health of babies. Yeah, that's fascinating to me. What is was it a large study or a fairly small study?
No, it was a fairly small study. There needs to be repeated data on a larger level and at different countries, obviously. But theoretically, it makes sense because we believe that a lot of the prognostic factors for the pregnancy are not determined only later on in the pregnancy, but the time of implantation, the time that the placenta implants. So all that high hormonal environment, it does make sense that it might create an environment that is not the best for the long-term effect of the child. But that data is still premature. Yeah, it's still premature. It hasn't been verified by multiple centers. But it tells you that it's not worse. So it's either a little better or it's the same. And that's what we want to make sure with frozen cycles, that we're not getting a detriment to miscarriages or the babies, etc. So it's no worse, it's better or the same.
Yeah, that's fascinating to me because one of the theories is that the uterine lining, the endometrium, is, and I realize this is not a medical term, but richer once the body has returned to normal after the
Right.
gonadotropins, and that makes sense then that your implantation would be different, and perhaps your placenta. Well, I don't know if the placenta would be different, but I guess it makes sense to me. But I just haven't read it. I'm fascinated by that. One last question on the frozen versus fresh. One of the issues, it seems to me, and this ties back into what we were talking about at the beginning, and that is transferring one or transferring two. Do you have a choice when you are freezing embryos to specify that you want them frozen one to a straw? In other words, just frozen individually so that you only have to thaw one, or nowadays, as it used to be that a number were frozen, but isn't that going to be problematic when you thaw? If you only wanted to transfer one and you thawed both of them, what's the chances of refreezing one? And surely there would be a greater attrition, failure to thaw.
It's excellent. Yes, I mean, ideally, I would bring it up with the lab that they should ideally freeze one at a time in individual straws. If you talk to I'm a clinician. If you talk to the PhDs in the lab, they will tell you that refreezing does not seem to have a detriment on the embryo, but just you would imagine that it might, and you don't want to take that chance. So I would address that with that center. But most PhDs in the lab will tell you that refreezing does not seem to have any deleterious effect. But if you want to take that out of the equation, then freeze them individually. Now, I think from a single embryo transfer point of view, I think it's very important for patients to realize that you want to look at the statistics cumulatively. That means if you put in one embryo in January, and you put in another embryo, let's say in February, versus putting them both in January, by the time you get to March, the same number of patients are going to be pregnant. So it's just taking longer, and you need another transfer. So, yes, if you want to maximize your pregnancy rate in 1 month, the more embryos you put in, the better. But if you're patient and look over time, the same number of women are going to get pregnant if you do 1, 1, 1. And, in fact, it might even be a little higher doing it that way. So
and your live birth rate would undoubtedly be higher because
would be high,
but if you do it subsequently, not because you would have fewer multiples, and so fewer risk of miscarriage and stillbirth or unhealthy children because they're born way too early.
That's correct. So it's a matter of patience, and it is more costly because if you're doing a frozen cycle and you have to do 2 or 3 frozen cycles each time, that is costing you more. Even though it's not a fresh IVF cycle, the frozen cycle still has a cost to it. So you have to weigh that all up. And I think that's where pre-implantation genetic screening leads into this discussion, because embryos on the day 5 or blastocyst stage can look pristine. They can be just like the patients mentioned, they can be very highly graded, but it doesn't mean that they're normal chromosomally. So, for example, a Down's embryo can look perfect. And then if it is abnormal, the body most of the time the body knows it's not a normal embryo and does not allow it to implant. If it does implant, that's the most common reason for miscarrying. Most miscarriages today, especially as we get into our mid and late 30s, is due to what we call aneuploidy, where the embryo is abnormal. So it's abnormal because you have too many or too few chromosomes. And it's random. It's not something anyone carries, but the egg is more fragile as the woman gets older. And so when the sperm and the egg come together in the DNA, there's a mix-up in the chromosomes. And instead of having 2 of everything, you might have 3 chromosome number 21s, which is Down's. So if you can now select the embryo even more carefully by doing genetic screening on the embryo, then by selecting it more carefully, now you feel even more confident of putting in a single embryo because it's more selected. So for our center and for my personal philosophy is that taking cost out of the equation, if I could for a minute, and I'll come back to that, if I could identify that embryo as precisely as possible, it's not perfect, and narrow the selection down, you will maximize that pregnancy rate even more so. So to put it in perspective, if you're 35 years old, there is a 50% chance that your embryo will be abnormal on testing. If you're 40 years old, there'll be a 75% chance your embryo will be abnormal. If you're 25-year-old, there'll be a 25%, so it goes up with age. That's the reason this technology and fertility as a whole is so inefficient in human beings, the high incidence of chromosomal problems in the embryo. So if you think about it, you have this 35-year-old patient with 2 blastocysts. If I just on a numbers basis, and it's obvious an average, I can assume that one of those embryos is probably abnormal, but I don't know which one that is. So, yes, that's why some patients would put in 2 embryos and say, well, one's probably abnormal, I'm going to go with 2. But if both happen to be normal, and that's where the twins occur. But if you can select it with genetic screening, then putting in one embryo makes even more sense because you've selected that embryo even more carefully. Now, with genetic testing...
We're going to swing back and talking about, no, that's fine, genetic testing at the end, because you raise the issue of cost, and there's some research that's recent research that addresses some of the issues associated with cost. Before we get off of the cost issue, I was glad you mentioned it because it was a great segue into my next question, which is one of the disincentives for single embryo transfer is that the way many clinics price IVF, there is an additional $3,000, $5,000, whatever, cost for each subsequent transfer. And as you pointed out, if you look at the total pregnancy rate per cycle, in other words, you go through an egg stimulation, and if you just transfer one embryo, and it may not take the first month, but then the next month or the following subsequent month, you transfer another one, your pregnancy rates will be similar by the cycle, maybe not for each transfer. But one disincentive to that is that it costs the patients more. Is there a movement, or have you seen a movement in pricing IVF such that there's not a financial disincentive to doing single embryo transfer?
Yes, and there are multiple centers today who will create packages for patients. So instead of paying for every blood and every ultrasound and every procedure, which is hard for the patient already, not knowing really what it's going to cost them at the end, if they have a center which has a package which says we're going to pay X number of dollars, and that number of dollars will give you a retrieval and up to 3 transfers, for example, and that would be a reduced rate for the transfers. I think that's a very good way to do it. It's increasing in how common that's done. We do that. Many other centers have those packages, and I think it's a very good idea, but not everybody does. And so that's where you see the evolution in this field, is looking at the cost side of it and creating these packages for our patients. Many of the states have coverage for IVF, so for the patient, how many transfers they do is not a concern, because most mandated states define a try as a retrieval. They don't distinguish how many transfers you do. So it very much depends on which state you're in and the center. And I would ask that question if you're a non-mandated state about, creating a package rate for multiple transfers. And I think it's a very good idea. That will incentivize the patient to not put the financial hardship into her decision-making, which should be purely medical in the health of both her and the baby.
Absolutely. You are listening to Creating a Family. Today we're talking about how to increase the pregnancy rates when going through IVF. Clout, the online influence ranker, now ranks Creating a Family as the number 2 online influencer worldwide in the area of infertility. We primarily hang out on the social networks at Facebook, Twitter, and Pinterest, and we would love to have you join us. We have a good time over there. We share a lot of information, provide a lot of support, so please do join us. There are 3 ways to connect with us on Facebook. You can connect with me personally. I'm Dawn.Davenport1, or you can like our Facebook page, which you can get to at facebook.com/creatingafamily, or you can join our Facebook support group. We're over 7,500 members right now, and we would be even better if you joined us. To get to that one, you could go to facebook.com/groups/creatingafamily, or quite frankly, the very easiest way to find us is just to type in the words Creating a Family in the Facebook search box, and you can like the page and join the group. It is a closed group, so you will have to apply to enter, and then we will admit you. On Twitter and Pinterest, we hang out at Creating a Family, and you can find us that way as well. Today we're talking with Dr. Brian Kaplan. He is a board-certified reproductive endocrinologist at Fertility Centers of Illinois. Dr. Kaplan, you've addressed some of this before, talking about transferring on day 3 or day 5, and as you mentioned, that was one of the. It's funny how advances are such. Sometimes advances look like they are, they're startling in their rapidity, or they're just startling and to all of us as to how we could come up with that. But for me, one of the most significant advances, and yet it isn't particularly heralded as a huge advance, is our ability to grow embryos to day 5 and even to day 6. And that has really changed the practice of IVF. And it's absolutely fascinating to me, and how that has come about, and it's really been fairly rapid. How long ago was it that it was pretty standard to not grow past day 3? Has that been in the last, say, 5 years, or is it further back than that?
Yes, it's between 5 and 7 years, I would say, and some centers have evolved into that quicker than others, as often happens. But I would say today in the U.S., most centers are very comfortable growing the embryos out to day 5. It's very important not only for selecting the embryo, but embryos freeze a lot more efficiently on day 5. The thaw rates are much higher. And so if you have to have good freezing technology, you have to be able to grow the embryos out to day 5. And then if you compound that with genetic screening, genetic testing on embryos should only be done if the embryo gets to day 5 or day 6 and it has an adequate grade to it. So if you're doing genetic screening, the prerequisite for that is, number 1, the ability to get to day 5, and number 2, the ability to freeze, because with genetic screening you have to freeze the embryo. So if you don't have good culture and a system in place to grow embryos out to day 5, everything is based on that foundation. So that it was very much a critical milestone.
It was. It's and one that we often don't mention, and I find it fascinating. Does it matter what day you transfer the embryos based on the woman's diagnosis or her age?
I don't believe that. I'm sure there will be different opinions. In my opinion, day 5 should be done, or blastocyst, irrespective of any of those factors.
Okay.
And because there is, between day 3 and day 5, the embryo undergoes a process called genomic activation. It's a critical timeline in the growth of the embryo, and that's when often things stop growing. So if you can get the embryo to day 5, you're going to have a higher chance of implanting. And so I don't really see personally a role, except in a few circumstances where day 3 makes sense.
We have a question from someone in our audience. She asked that I not use her name. She said, I have diminished ovarian reserve and only got 2 mature eggs in this round of IVF. 4 were retrieved, 1 was immature, and 2 fertilized via ICSI. That's intracytoplasmic sperm injection. On day 3, I had 1 10-cell and 1 8-cell. The chances of them making it to day 5 are unknown, and I could end up risking it all. My doctor suggested putting in both on day 3. What are the statistical chances I get pregnant with a singleton versus twins after this transfer? Thanks so much for all you do. Your podcast and the group has been a remarkable resource of support and education for me during this time. Well, you're very welcome for that. So this may be you may not know off the top of your head what the statistical chances are, but can you talk to her? I'm guessing it sounds like, since she sent this question in, that she has already transferred to 1 8-cell and 1 10-cell on day 3, and she's asking what the chances are.
So I think that is a circumstances where I can see the physician and the patient electing to do a day 3 transfer. It all depends to a large degree. I don't know if she mentioned her age, which I think is a critical point in her situation.
I was looking at that. She did not. She does have diminished ovarian reserve. She did say
diminished reserve. So it's very different for someone who's 32 years old to put in 2 embryos on day 3 versus someone who's 40 years old. Let me assume that she's 38 years old. By putting in those two embryos in a typical lab, the success rate would probably be around 30%, in that range. Now, I don't know the statistics in her specific lab, but probably 30%. Of that 30% at 38 years old, her twin rate would probably be 15% of 30. So that's probably 4.5%, if that. So her twin rate in that situation would be relatively low. The question there is, if you grew those embryos out to day 5, how many would make it? And typically at 38 years old, with those quality embryos, we would expect one at least to make it. So for me, I think it's the way to do it is to put in a single embryo on day 5. I would rather than put in 2 embryos on day 3, because number one, I have the information going forward that she grows embryos out to day 5. That's very important for me to know that she has the ability to do that. Number 2, it obviously reduces the twin rate. And thirdly, if they don't make it to day 5, it is our philosophy that they probably wouldn't have made it in her body anyhow. You're just finding out at that point in time, rather than spending 2 weeks on intramuscular progesterone, waiting for your results, spending 2 weeks being very anxious, when if they wouldn't have made it, they probably wouldn't have made it anyhow. But in her situation, if she was on the older age group, if she has only 2, that might be an indication to put in 3. And I understand that that's not a bad decision at all.
And why? Because she only had 2. Is it because as she put it, the risk of losing it all? But from what you're saying, there wouldn't be. If she's going to lose them, she would lose them anyway. Yeah.
That's our thinking, and that can be argued. So some centers would say, well, you don't know that, and that perhaps her embryos might do better in the environment of the uterus. But if you look at large data, that's unlikely. So that's the discussion and the that we have and the debate we have amongst all of us. And some patients want to know, at least I gave myself a chance by doing a transfer. Yeah. So it's very much based on the personality of the patient. Does she say, well, I want to know up front, I'd rather know and not have to wait? Or, you know what, even if it's a 1% chance, I want to know that I at least put the embryos in and gave myself a shot. So that's what has to be discussed individually with the patient. Yeah,
and I'm really glad to hear you say that, because that is, I mean, there's so many factors, including temperament, personality, how many failures you've had, how many times you think you can do this, either financially, emotionally, or whatever, your diagnosis, etc. So this is not a cookie cutter. You have to individualize.
That's correct. It's not a cookie cutter. And just rough numbers, in my opinion, putting in 2 embryos on day 3 will give you a very similar pregnancy rate to putting in 1 on day 5.
Gotcha. Okay.
But day 5 is more efficient.
So, well, and not only that, but then you potentially then have another embryo
later on, yes.
That you could then use for later on and save yourself the cost of another full IVF cycle. So, I mean, there's that to think about as well. All right. We had started talking earlier about pre-implantation genetic screening. And that's an interesting one where we were talking about advances. That's a little more of a wow advance. You know, that's one that's certainly gotten a lot of attention. It is, I mean, absolutely miraculous. I mean, to me, it really is. How we can do that, and it has a lot to do both with technology and also just with the whole movement towards genetics and medicine. But nonetheless, that's been a very impressive one. One of the, so we're going to talk about that in just general. But one of the problems with that is that it's not inexpensive. And the high cost has made it a hard choice for some patients. So let's talk. I want to, and you've done some research on something called next generation DNA sequencing, and I want to move the discussion there. But let's talk just very generally to give everybody a grounding of what we're talking about PGS. Then give us an idea of what that would typically cost, and then we'll talk about next generation DNA sequencing. So what is PGS?
So PGS is the ability to identify whether the embryo has its normal complement or number of chromosomes. That's often where things go wrong in the human being. It's not perfect. There are certain chromosomal abnormalities we don't pick up, But once again, you narrow the probability down by selecting the embryo more carefully. And if you do that, and if you select an embryo that is as chromosomal normal as possible, you would have a higher implantation rate, and you would have a lower miscarriage rate, because that's the reason for most miscarriages. And for the odd patient, which can be devastating, you're going to find out earlier, before you put the embryo in, rather than later on have to make a decision at CVS or amniocentesis at 12 or 13 weeks about a Downs or an abnormal baby. So intellectually, it makes sense. Why would we not test an embryo before you're pregnant to make sure as much as possible that we're putting in as normal an embryo as science has available to measure? We do that always in all health. We're trying to maximize probabilities of health. So it makes sense. The downside to it is it's very the technology is much more involved. Number one, the embryo has to get to day 5. Number 2, you have to biopsy an embryo. So think about an embryo which you cannot even see with your naked eye, and you're taking 4 or 5 cells from the outer membrane. There's no harm to the embryo. Those studies have been done, but you have to have a lab that does it frequently. You can't biopsy something that small without having experience. Just like you wouldn't go and have your knee done with someone who does once every 3 months. You want a center that does a lot of PGS. And then you have to freeze the embryo to put it in a subsequent month. So as long as all that technology is in place and that center is very comfortable doing all of that, then it makes much more sense. Now, the downside is the technology of measuring the chromosomes keeps evolving, because there's a question of accuracy. How accurate is the genetic screening? And that's where next generation sequence comes into play. There have been different techniques at a genetic level of how to identify the different chromosomes and how accurate it is. Now, I'm not a geneticist or a PhD, but NGS is now the cutting edge of testing embryos, because you want to make sure when you tell that patient that this embryo is 95% normal, that it's truly 95%, not 60%. You don't want to be leaving behind an embryo that you diagnosed as not normal, that is actually normal and has the potential to implant. So the accuracy of the testing is getting better and better, and it's still not perfect. But NGS is the most sophisticated technology of doing that today. Most people would say that the accuracy today is in the 90% range for testing with PGS. So once again, it's an expectation as a physician that you have to explain to the patient, this is not 100%, but once again, you're narrowing the probability of trying to get pregnant, healthy, high success rates, greater selection of embryos, less miscarriage rates. And I think the miscarriage rate, if you give me a minute, is very important, because we underestimate what miscarriages do to our patients. Miscarriages for a woman, and those that are listening know how difficult that is. You miscarry at 2 to 3 months, you've wasted now 2 to 3 months of time. You have to wait 2 months to try again. It's almost half a year. You're 38 years old. 6 months is a long duration for that age. The mental trauma of having a miscarriage, you need a DNC, the possibility of scarring with a DNC, all these things come into play, and many patients drop out from treatment because of the intensity emotionally and financially. So we can't underestimate and just look at a miscarriage as though, it failed. We've got to look at that, what that does to our patients, and how do we do everything we can from a medical and technology point of view to reduce that probability of miscarrying. And the only way you can do that is, at this point, is by doing genetic screening on the embryo to narrow that probability. And PGS will do that. So that's, I think, a very important point from a physician point of view, to look at not just getting pregnant and saying, okay, my patient's pregnant, she goes to see her obstetrician, I've done my job, and now it's up to everybody else. You've got to look at the global, let me put it that way, picture, because that can be devastating. And so PGS for me is very worthwhile doing. The expense part, it can vary between $3,000 and $6,000 in different centers. So it is an expense. If you look at cost in the medical system as a whole, it actually reduces costs, because miscarriages cost, DNCs cost, amniocentesis cost, Down's babies cost millions of dollars, time off work for our patients where it takes longer to get pregnant, all that costs, but we don't pay for it in our system. So we don't look at the costs of all of those things. But what PGS does, at the end, the bottom line is it increases your time to pregnancy. So you're going to get pregnant quicker because you're not going to put in all these abnormal embryos until you hit the right one. And you're not going to have the miscarriage or lower the chance of miscarrying, so you don't delay that. So it increases timeline to pregnancy, and that's very important for a lot of our patients. They want to be more efficient.
Well, they need to be, because we say it all the time. We talk in real estate, the most important three things are location, location, location. But in infertility, the most important three things are age, age, and age. So, it's not just a matter of impatience, especially because oftentimes we certainly see it in our audience and our community that people have tried on their own perhaps longer than they should have before getting into treatment. So often when they are entering treatment, they're already in their, early to mid-20s, and I mean not 20s, 30s, many of them more approaching the 35. So, so it matters. Now, we've talked about two things that I want to make sure that we are clear for our audience. We've given two acronyms, PGS and NGS. So help us distinguish those two, just to make certain that we've been clear for our audience.
So PGS is the name for screening of embryos. Pre-implantation, before you're pregnant, genetic screening. So the family name is PGS. That's how the concept of screening embryos. Mm-hmm. NGS is one of the techniques used to do that. There are other techniques as well. So at the lab level, how do you do that? NGS being one of those techniques to do that. And we send our cells from the embryo off to a genetic lab that will use one of the techniques, NGS being one of them, to look at the chromosomes.
And is there a difference in the PGS techniques, of which NGS is one? And NGS stands, by the way, next generation sequencing. Is there a difference? Did I understand you to say that the next generation sequencing increases the accuracy of your findings? Did I understand you correctly there?
That's 100%. And
okay.
I would, and when you as a patient sit in front of your physician, the physician is going to be comfortable using a certain genetic lab from the experience they've had with that lab, how consumer friendly they are, their cost factors, the technology they use. So I would be, you as a patient sit with that physician. You don't want to discuss with them why they use one genetic test over the other. They've done that information. They've done their homework. And so you want to go with what that lab is comfortable using, the genetic lab they use.
Gotcha. And the prices, is there any difference? The prices that you gave, the $3,000 to $6,000, are pretty standard for any of the techniques that are utilized for pre-implantation genetic screening.
Yes, that's correct. We hope with technology that eventually it'll go down, but that's for all the techniques, yes.
Yeah. And it's an interesting thing that you point out, and it's true, and this happens in our healthcare system more often than not, it feels like. But the actual cost would be less because you're not running the risks of, well, as you point out, the costs associated with a miscarriage, or the cost affiliated with the carrying to term, or having to make a decision to not carry to term of a fetus that has genetic abnormalities. But insurance doesn't tend to cover that, or doesn't tend to view it that way. Are you seeing, and you may not know the answer to this, I'm just curious, are you seeing that many insurance policies that are covering IVF, and that's an issue in and of itself, a lot of them don't, but for those that do, are they also covering PGS, or is that considered an add-on cost that the patient has to incur?
The vast majority do not cover it, so it would be an exception that they cover it. And your point is very critical, because if you really looked at the cost of the insurance company, if they have to take care at some point of time of a twin or triplet pregnancy in an ICU, which is millions of dollars, or an unhealthy baby, in the long run, it's not. It would be financially make sense if they covered PGS on everybody. In the long run, it would be far more cost effective. But patients change insurance all the time, and the insurance companies are not looking at where they will be in 6 months or a year, because that will probably change. So it's not looked at as a whole. But if I was an insurance company, I would stipulate that patients put in a single embryo that's genetically screened, and I would pay for all of that because at the end of the day, that would be most cost effective for me as a company, but also much better for the patient from an outcome point of view. So everybody wins.
Well, you're preaching to the choir on that one. I would agree wholeheartedly on that. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Kaplan, for being with us today. Let me remind our audience, keep in mind that the information given in this interview is general advice. To understand how it applies to your specific situation, please work with your infertility professional. If you have enjoyed this show and want to help us grow, do us a favor and give us a rating on iTunes. That's how iTunes knows how to recommend us, and we are the #1 rated show by far. We're actually listed on the iTunes homepage under What's Hot. So we want to keep that, and we really would appreciate a ranking. It's fast and easy. It's just give us a star. Not a star. Give us as many stars as you want. If for those people, and I'm sure there are, want to get more information about Dr. Kaplan or the Fertility Centers of Illinois, you can go to their website, which is, and it's going to take me a second, it's fcionline.com. And the FCI would stand for Fertility Centers of Illinois, online.com, FCIONLINE.com. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I will see you next week.
Hi, it's Jamie, Progressive #1, #2 employee. Leave a message at the... Hey, Jamie, it's me, Jamie. This is your daily pep talk. I know it's been rough going ever since people found out about your a cappella group, Mad Harmony, but you will bounce back. I mean, you're the guy always helping people find coverage options with the Name Your Price tool. It should be you giving me the pep talk. Now get out there, hit that high note, and take Mad Harmony all the way to nationals this year! Sorry, it's pitchy.
Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law.
The Starlight Lounge presents An Evening with the Progressive Box.
Old moon, yeah. That's Hugo, tickling the ivories. He just saved by bundling home and auto with Progressive. Gonna finally buy a ring for that gal of yours, Hugo? Send her my condolences. Hi-oh! This next one's for you, too. There's a burglar in my heart. Thank you.
Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Discounts not available in all states or situations.